Good afternoon. I am so excited to be here and want to welcome each and every one of you for joining us. I'm Mike Hyder, President and CEO of the Executive Leadership Council, the preeminent membership organization that's committed to increasing the number of global Black executives in C-suites, on corporate boards, and in global enterprises. At the ELC, we work to build an inclusive business leadership pipeline that empowers global Black leaders to make an impactful contribution in the marketplace and the global communities that they serve in. Our primary focus will always be to nurture and amplify Black excellence and leadership in business. That's why I'm delighted to moderate a critical conversation about why making the business case for diversity, equity, and inclusion has failed in corporate America and what we can do better. Today's discussion comes 1 year after the release of Beyond Promises to Progress, an ELC study which challenged corporate CEOs to sustain the commitments made in the wake of George Floyd's murder and the rise of Black Lives Matter. The paper, written by Dr. Stephanie Curry from the Wharton School and commissioned by our ELC Legacy Group, provides a roadmap for real progress, prescribing measurable tactics and systems-based strategies to help companies move forward. But our research is only one part of a larger story around the opportunity gaps and glaring misunderstandings around the value of increased diversity can bring to global enterprises. And despite repeated studies showing companies who exhibit cultural, ethnic, and gender diversity are significantly more likely to outperform less diverse organizations on profitability, making the business case isn't resonating. Well, joining me to discuss these challenges and the way forward is Google's Chief Diversity Officer and ELC member, Melanie Parker, Bloomberg's Managing Diversity Reporter, Jeff Green, Nielsen's Senior Vice President for DE&I, Diverse Insights, Intelligence, and Initiatives, Stacy Diarmas, and the University of Georgia's Assistant Professor for Strategic Management, Dr. Sean-Wan Jung. Each of these distinguished cross-sector diversity, equity, and inclusion experts will share their perspectives on the unintended consequences of systemic barriers in corporate America, how shareholders lose when Black executives are shut out of leadership position opportunities, and how employees and consumers will set a new course for corporate success and the future of DE&I. Throughout our conversation, feel free to submit questions, and we'll do our best to answer them during the Q&A session. And so for any members of the media out there who wish to ask a question, please add your name and the outlet you represent to your comment. So panelists, thank you all so much for being here. Dr. John, let's start with you. Your research is part of the reason that we're here today. We know that women and minority leaders tend to yield a better ROI and tend to improve employee morale and overall satisfaction. But your recent study found that it had an immediate impact on market capitalization, with valuation jumping up to 3.1% within 3 days of announcing a Black CEO. That seems pretty compelling of an argument for having more diverse leadership. My question is, what is creating that reaction in the markets? And do you think that this is an anomaly or a trend that we will continue to see?
Thank you for the question. First of all, thank you to the Executive Leadership Council for hosting this much needed conversation. And I'm also truly honored to join this esteemed group of panelists, and I look forward to our discussion. So yeah, to answer your question, first of all, our findings of a positive stock market reaction to the announcement of a Black CEO is indeed consistent with the business case for diversity at the top of companies. And you asked why there is such a positive reaction. So let me briefly explain. What we think is going on is there is a higher bar for advancement for minority CEOs and Black CEOs in particular. Throughout the course of their careers and in their personal lives, as um, Black professionals face a lot of barriers, and they have to overcome a lot, right? So the Black executives who do make it to the very exclusive position of a CEO, we just find that are very exceptional in many ways. Theoretically, the way we observe this exceptionality is through education in our study. So when we look at years of education, Black CEOs compared to a comparable group of white CEOs have more years of education, are more likely to have an advanced degree, and to have had a degree from an elite university. And like I mentioned, this is only one way we could actually measure this, but we can imagine, and I think you would agree, that there are different ways in which minorities, because of the higher bar to advancement that they face, could be more exceptional. So what this suggests is that there is a pool of talent that potentially is being shut out, but the market is also realizing that, yeah, it is very difficult for minorities, especially for Black professionals, to reach the top of organizations. But when they do, the markets do recognize this, and they do reward them through this, albeit short, stock market reaction that is positive.
Well, I guess it's something to be said that there's a positive around at least one group that at least acknowledges what it takes to become CEO.
Right.
Although it's sad to say that that's represented that way, but I really appreciate your perspective. Jeff, Stacy, Melanie, anything else to add based on your own sort of perception around this? Melanie, I see your energy.
Yes, well, I really identify with what Dr. Young said about how Black professionals are prepared. I know personally, and many of my colleagues, that we were trained to be better, faster, smarter, to compete at average, because our families, our communities, like really poured in to be better and to be more advanced. And that was the only way to compete at the same level. And so I do agree, the preparation that Black professionals get when they reach the height or the pinnacle of their career, really is a standout and is recognized that way. So I just wanted to echo both personally, by experience, as well as by affinity group, that I really am so encouraged by the research and can personally identify.
And I think what I might add is more in line with the research, right? So the point that Dr. Sean brought up was that companies increase in value when they make this, and this sort of an announcement of a Black CEO. And so the work that I do at Nielsen is a little bit different, right? It's about representation in media and content, and how consumers relate with brands that have, DE&I messages within their, either their advertising or in their product placement. And so one of the things that I wanted to bring up was that you think about the value of a company increasing when there's a decision like this made. Our research shows that nearly 60% of African Americans, as an example, say that they want to do business with and they want to buy from brands that feature people from their identity group within the advertising. We also know that increasingly consumers are holding brands accountable to walk the talk, right? There's a lot of dialogue around investing with Black communities, but who is really doing the work and showing up? And when companies do that, consumers respond positively, as we've seen in a number of cases. And in fact, I think consumers believe, or they've told us that they believe, that statements like this, movements like this, investing in the community in this way is a proxy for their brand values. So I wanted to, bring that point forward too, that consumers are holding brands and companies in general accountable for walking the talk.
And I could add to that too. I mean, one of the factors is my profession. I mean, this is sort of the bad news is good news kind of situation, because it's so rare still. I mean, there may be a half a dozen big company Black CEOs at the moment. So when this happens, I write it. I mean, it doesn't matter what company in the S&P 500 adds a Black CEO. I'm going to write a story because I want to point out this is not common. And so there's going to be coverage as well, which is going to, I mean, I do not write a story every time there's a CEO change in the S&P 500, but I guarantee this is rare enough and interesting enough and important enough that we're going to write about it. And so I think that's also probably a factor, is people are seeing this covered. Maybe it wasn't, I mean, it's a good thing, but it's for a bad reason. I think that's a factor here too.
Yeah, well, see, and that's why we have these various voices here, because that's an interesting perspective. I don't think very many people think about. But one thing that I wanted to at least acknowledge when I used the term 3.1% market cap impact after, I think, 3 days, right, Dr. Zhang? Yes. Conversely, white male CEOs, Jeff, and perhaps it's because it's normalized in terms of the frequency. But the market cap it dropped, 0.91 or something like that?
Right. Statistically, that wasn't significant. So basically, there isn't a significant market reaction.
Okay. All right. You heard it here, folks. Clarity. But it's still interesting. I don't think very many people think about market cap impact behind an announcement when people get fixated on the optics as the primary driver of how they identify what happened or what's actually being published. So that's well said. So let me build on that, because I want to open this up for all of us. It's been more than, say, 2 years, and over $200 billion later, since the death of George Floyd. Our own research at the ELC coincides with others and shows that meaningful and effective DE&I requires a holistic approach, long-term investments, and well-defined metrics to be successful over time. So my ask of my esteemed panelists here is, with the current political climate that seems intent on undermining these efforts further, and the threat of a recession looming, what, from your perspective, does the future of DE&I look like? What do you think?
I think the future is bright. I think that what the murder of George Floyd allowed us to do was, it really was symbolic and like a clarion call for action. And we saw corporations respond in a way that we didn't see in the Civil Rights Act, the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s. And corporations have been called to account in a way that's different. And, what I found at Google, our goal has been to continue deepening sustainable equity, both internally and externally. But there's a duality that exists when you're standing in the work. Well, there's the reality of what you said you were going to do, but then there's the reality, once you're in that work, there's more work to do, and it's not bolt-on work. To really address systemic and structural barriers, it is multi-year. It does take a long time. And in many cases, it's an overhaul. And I see that work happening and the conversation changing in ways that we haven't seen before. So certainly, a lot more opportunity for us to, capture and take advantage of, and more progress to make. But I think we've had a really strong start. So I believe the future is still bright.
And I want to add to that. Melanie, I agree with you. I know that there are a lot of challenges forthcoming. We always hear about budget cuts and DE&I being among them, or perhaps underfunded. But as Melanie suggested, after George Floyd's murder, it gave permission, in some ways permission, in other ways, I think just brought about all people exploring their individual diverse identities, right? Whether it was race or ethnicity or sexual orientation, exploring them and feeling empowered to discuss and share them. And in the same way, it brought together communities to empower each other, right? So this conversation moved from dare I say, different parts in corporate America. I've been doing this for 2 decades, and different conversations around advocacy groups. But it really brought it into into focus for companies and for people who prior weren't really part of this conversation in a way that it moved all of us. Right. So there isn't a conversation that you can have today, certainly not we're in media and entertainment. So certainly in my space, either within the organization or with our clients who are media companies that are serving up content that we're all consuming, that DE&I isn't part of that conversation, either in terms of talent and acquisition and whose projects we're greenlighting and if we have creators of color, or whether we're thinking about our own company makeup and our BRGs and what we're doing to develop our own talent. So I agree with you, Melanie. I think there will be challenges, as there always has been in this work, but I think the tides are strongly in favor of DE&I continuing to be part of the conversation, most specifically because consumers and people are having this dialogue now in a way that before was really, again, sort of within advocacy groups in different areas of HR. And today it's a conversation we're all having.
Mm-hmm. What Stacey said is kind of important because a lot of the progress that gets made is made by pressure. I mean, most of it, in fact, is made by pressure from somewhere. The activist investors will put pressure on companies. And what you saw in these last 2 years is a lot of movement in terms of hiring, both at the sort of base employee level, but also people on boards. There was a lot of movement very quickly, like record paces. Michael and I talked about this repeatedly, record pace of hiring. And so now that some of the pressure may be ebbing a little bit from maybe in the corporate environment, the employees, the consumers, and the new hires, the new executives, the new power structure might finally be in a position to actually play a role in this. I mean, that's been the question before, it's kind of been external pressure, but now it's becoming more of an internal motivation, and that might be what's different this time, I think.
Yes, and if I may jump in on that point, I think there is given the challenges of the current environment, as Mr. Hyder mentioned, it seems like we can't catch a break, right? It's one crisis after another these days, and I hope, to the point about what companies can do internally, I hope companies could realize that during times of crisis, during times of challenges, might be precisely when a minority CEOs or Black CEOs, according to our research, might really be a good fit to come in and be the change agent. Who better than somebody who has overcome a lot, right? Who's faced a higher bar for advancement throughout their lives, and has exceptional qualities, and can in many ways could serve as change agents to lead companies during such times. So I think I agree with the panelists that there's hope ahead, and there are opportunities. And as somebody who is studying corporate governance and CEOs, I think there is a lot of value in looking towards companies making that leap, right, and hiring someone who's different, right, for a change, right, someone who can who's very resilient, who might be really good fit to lead us during these times.
Yeah, I'm mindful of the fact that, just using the ELC as an example, where 36 years is a nanosecond in history ago when the ELC was founded, and there were 19 Black executives who, I guess, thought among themselves that it would be useful to be more formal around supporting one another with the expectation of trying to increase the opportunities for more Black vice president level people. And this was before Cliff Warden was even CEO of TIA. So that had never even happened prior to that point in time. And we're 800 members strong today, and 36 years later, which feels crazy in terms of the significance compared to how the representation of people at that level. But it is interesting, and I'm saying these statistics for your reaction as it relates to this topic. This looking at the Black professionals specifically, 3% of executive level roles are Black. 1% of Fortune 500 CEOs, give or take, are Black. The racial wealth gap is still like it widened 3 times between 1984 and 2013. Black men earn 87% of white male earnings, Black women 63%. 7% of all managers in Fortune 500 are Black, 1.4 of them are women. So there's this dynamic where in 2021, given all of this energy and effort, that those numbers are still normal as opposed to anything being close to parity. Yet the question about the business case needs to be made and strengthened. And I guess just to stimulate some discussion, especially Stacey in the business that you happen to be in, and Jeff relative to your network of information, and just in the face of optimism, which I agree, just talk about why do we think those numbers are still so grossly underrepresented in spite of all the conversations we're having?
I have 2 perspectives. So first, you're right. We are still going to face hiccups, and in fact, we did. Black women's equal pay day was, more than 6 weeks later this year than it was last year. Latina equal pay day was, more than almost 2 months later than it was last year. So women of color, in particular Black women, are that we haven't seen that sort of shift in terms of equality, or we see it and then we don't. It sort of ebbs and flows. Granted, part of that is probably from a relic of the pandemic and hardships that all women, and particular women of color, faced. So when I was agreeing with Melanie earlier, and I know she'll agree with this too, I still do think there are brighter days ahead. I do think we are going in the right direction. There will be hiccups, there will be setbacks. And then the second perspective I wanted to bring is, so in the work that I do, I focus on representation in television. I focus on representation in content, right? And we've talked a lot about stereotyping and that's part of it. But the other part of it is just plain presentation, how often people are presented within content. One of the more interesting facts that we've looked at recently is African Americans presentation within content. So of course, thematically, but also just in general, how often are Black people presented within content and on screen? And as a result of some of the things we've been talking about, we've seen an increase in representation in content. In fact, now for broadcast television, over-indexing, right? So presented more frequently than the percentage of the population would I guess call for, right? There's more representation than the percentage of the population. Yet, interestingly, nearly half of the people that we talked to said, half of the Black people that we talked to said that while representation is up in television, they've never felt more poorly represented than they do today. So I'm taking this sort of presentation within content and media and how we think about entertainment, how it influences who becomes hireable and how people see our capabilities. And think about that also just in terms of what's happening today within business. Just because you are presented or numbers increase for representation doesn't necessarily mean that people are feeling that they're having the type of responsibilities that they deserve or career advancement as quickly as they deserve. So as we're sort of sorting this out in several different spaces, and I'm taking my experience in media as a proxy for what we're seeing also happening in corporate America.
Yeah, fascinating. Well said. Yeah.
I love that example, Stacey, and I agree with you. When we think about Black talent, what we find is that Black talent is either hyper visible or invisible. And in between that is a lot of stress for, Black professionals. And so even though the business case is more than clear, the talent is available, what the example that Stacey gave really points out that we have to normalize Black talent. If Black talent continues to be a unicorn, that is elusive and we can't find, if that's the belief system, we'll continue to have this problem. But when we normalize Black talent, we normalize Black excellence, then we normalize our Black talent continue to progress to these types of executive CEO level and equivalent roles. And so I think it's really important. And it's why, equity is so important, because with equity, it means that we have to do more, to the point Stacey made, of having more representation in the media, but the experiences weren't felt. Because while we're looking at that, we also have to look at the lived experiences at the same time. So I think there is optimism, Mike, because we weren't having these conversations and we weren't identifying all of the factors that have to, really be on the board in order to make this type of progress.
Yeah. Well,
I think there's also,
go ahead, Jeff. Sorry. Go
I
ahead.
should say there's also the sort of this social norm that comes into business, where business people are kind of looking around and trying to decide where is the bar. Sadly, it's not parity is not what people are looking for. They're looking for, where do I need to be right now so no one yells at me, is maybe sort of the way a CEO or the executive team is looking. And we were just talking, before the broadcast, that there's this data that shows 70% of people, or high 60% of people, agree this is really important. And an equally high number of DEI executives agree they don't have the resources to take care of it. So there's kind of people are looking around, they're saying, well, maybe I see that we had a Black president, we have a Black vice president, they're feel like they see representation. And this is, I'm talking as the people in power, so white people, and maybe feel like the pressure's off on that. I got this other thing, I've got a recession coming or whatever. It's always kind of there's a report called Tokenism, you get 2 women on your board and you can relax. And then it became Threekenism. And it's this idea that there's a social norm that develops and people get kind of comfortable, and there's not pressure. That comes back to what we were talking about before. What will the pressure be like for people to move beyond where we are if they start to feel well, we're kind of okay. It's not horrible. It's better than it was. And I think that's the impediment to what you guys are talking about.
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, when you look at these trends, there are trends that indicate that the country will be a multicultural majority by 2044, and that people are increasingly concerned about with an organization's values and commitments and overall social responsibility, and they're watching these DE&I commitments closely. To Stacey's point about younger folks in particular, I mean, this is a thing. When you think about the trends of our multicultural majority direction, but people are becoming more and more concerned about how organizations values commitments and social responsibility, and they're watching DE&I. What are the dangers of not getting this right as it relates to talent acquisition, retention, profitability, or even reputation management, for that matter? What are the dangers of not getting this right?
I think all of that is impacted. I mean, certainly brand reputation, but also not having the talent in place to really ensure that the business is profitable, not having the right people at the table, the right voices to make sure that we're really innovating and building products and services for all people, which goes back to the profit margin. So all of that is at risk if we don't get that right.
And I would just double down on that. We, as you opened, Mike, this particular question talking about the multicultural majority, America, we are at the precipice of a demographic revolution. We're within it. It started. And so strictly speaking on profitability, you mentioned a lot of things about talent and all of those are critical, but strictly speaking just on profitability, it makes perfect business sense to ensure that you are, thinking about consumers, your R&D, everything through a multicultural and a diverse lens. And that's just good business. So I think, we've been talking about that for a long time. The industry has, it makes good business sense. And these are the new consumers. But we're getting to this point in our journey on this demographic revolution as a country where it's not even it's just the way that we continue to be and maintain profitability. So unfortunately, that may be what pushes the rest of brands this direction. We wish that they would do it, of course, for the right reasons, but business is business. And so the good news is that is coming. And I suppose that's my contribution there. We are in a demographic revolution.
Good. Well, thank you.
And it's interesting to watch this because, that's what we do. We're watching to see what's really happening. All the companies are saying exactly what Stacey's saying. This is a demographic revolution, majority, minority nation. We're going to see this sea change. And yet, if you turn down the volume and you just look at the statistics, Latino, Hispanic people who are going to be the biggest, or at least tied for the biggest demographic group in this country in that time frame, continue to be ever more underrepresented every year in positions of power. So it's interesting. I unfortunately, I think maybe it is going to take somebody looking around and trying to figure out why they're losing customers and get more direct proof. This goes right to your point, the failure of the business case, because everybody knows this, but it's and everybody's saying it, but it's not showing up in, at least very quickly, in action.
Yeah.
And Jeff, as they grow, though, as these consumer segments grow, they're going to continue to hold brands accountable. And so, perhaps that's also when we'll see it.
Yeah.
Yes, I agree, with Stacey that, as these demographic changes occur, increasingly, not getting diversity right, not being able to manage diversity is going to be not a missed opportunity for more profits, but actually a risk for the business. So, if I'm an executive looking at this changing world, it would be wise to try to start building these capabilities for diversity management, because it's not a natural thing. Like one thing, to the theme of the business case and why it hasn't had a bigger impact. Well, research also shows that there is a cost, right? It's not automatic, right? When you introduce a group of different people from different backgrounds, different cultures, there is going to be some conflict, at least initially. So companies that have figured out how to manage this are going to get ahead, right, as the demographics shift. So this is a capability that I hope companies are looking to build.
Yeah.
I think the start of this actually was the Great Resignation, which I think of as the Great Reflection. I think people are resigning from not just companies, but old ways of thinking, old ways of thoughts. And they're doing that with their feet. I think knowledge workers have a lot of control. So I think we're already seeing the pressure, the call, the calling out. And I think, it's the responsibility of corporate America to do that calling in and to build sustainable equity, both in our walls and outside of our walls. And we have to do that as a collective, because no one company or organization is going to do it. We have to do this in lockstep.
Yeah. One thing I want to make sure, I guess, and I call a shameless plug, as a former corporate executive who's now serving powerful executives like you, Melody, and others, is for the business community not to lose sight. And Jeff, you triggered this. Representation towards leading and running things, as opposed to just employed, is a way of thinking about where representation, with the optimism that we're so well articulating, the real what I call significant sea change will be when the percentages of Black and brown professionals are at the VP, director, VP, and senior VP and C-suite levels versus just merely employed, which is typically what is used when the word representation. I'm talking from in a business environment context. Is this something to be conscious of? Because I don't think people are as deliberate about that journey as they are about representation, numerically speaking. Now, I'm told there are a lot of questions that this conversation has already stimulated. and I'm receiving them, and I am going to share with the time we have some questions from the audience, because I think that's the ones that matter the most, because it's exactly what people want to hear about. So there's my first question for you is, and this is probably just a build, Dr. Jung, on what you were talking about, is the market cap sustained following the initial announcement with respect to the research you were involved in?
So in our research, we only looked at a short-term stock market reaction. The most we were able to extend our observations was about a 10-day window following the announcement. The reason for this is that it's just, it's a research reason, right? So it's hard to establish causality beyond that. There are research designs in which we could do that, but in our study, we were only looking at a short-term stock market reaction.
Got it. Okay. Here's the second question. I feel like I'm one of those game show hosts. It seems that many companies do this as window dressing and as a reputational play with no real movement internally or externally. Do we expect to see that change moving forward?
I do expect to see this change going forward. At Google, in 2014, we released our first diversity annual report. And, we're leaders, we're learners, we do both of those things transparently, but we published 10 pages of publicly available DEI data in the back and in the index. And we started open sourcing that data using BigQuery a year ago so people could interpret it. And Mike, I think you actually touched on this. We have to measure each part of the cycle. So how many people are going into leadership, not just representation, which is hiring minus attrition, but the transparency that companies are being called to account for looks at how are people progressing, what levels are they progressing to, not just are we hiring, and then are we retaining all employees equally across all communities. And so I do see more and more companies putting this level of rigor and the transparency in. So I think there is a trend that's pushing forward, albeit not as fast as we would hope.
Yeah.
And I'd like to build on what Melanie said, because we've been pushing for the past couple of years for companies to do just that. Like we'd asked the S&P 100 to give us their the private federal gender and race data that they report every year, give it to us publicly. And when we started, about 12 of them did, and Google's one of them that does. When we did the last round, I think we were up to 96 that either did or promised to. So companies are, and these are not pretty this is not paint a pretty picture. This is not diversity data that shows progress. It shows the work that yet needs to be done. So I think that's a good sign that more and more companies are willing to show pay that's not flattering. They're willing to show diversity that's not flattering. They're willing to throw stuff out there so that you can track their progress in ways they just weren't willing to do it 10 or 15 years ago. So even if they aren't maybe in a hurry, people are going to know, they're going to be able to see the failures now way more readily than you could even 5 years ago. So I think that is something that the pressure might be able to be sustained because the data is going to be out there. Transparency is definitely the key. And that's what we're watching as journalists. We're watching for transparency. Don't tell, show us.
I almost wasn't going to say this, but I feel like it makes sense here. One other measure of that is we're talking, of course, here about people and about their journey and their development and whether or not we have people of color at senior levels within an organization. And that is critically important for DEI and why we're here. But the other measure I think that's really important about how a company really feels and embraces DE&I is on the product and marketing side. We can put all of our efforts and we should put many of them into, developing, retaining and recruiting diverse talent and seeing them through their journey at an organization. But I think about the work we're doing at Nielsen, and in addition to that work, the other thing that we did that our CEO absolutely insisted that we did is that we take the same values of inclusion that we see within DE&I and we bring those into the work that we do every day. So that means a new product that I talked a little bit about evaluating inclusion on television. That isn't something that we had operationalized before, but that's something that as a result of George Floyd's murder and just all the movement in 2020, that our CEO said, we are going to develop a way to measure inclusion and representation within television content. That's what we can do in our circle, right? I mean, within our power. We are going to ensure that the products that we have, the services that we provide, have this same DE&I values layered in. So when our clients ask us about, I talked earlier about advertising, I talked about inclusion within brand creative, right? These are things that are very, they're just for my industry, right? But the point I'm making for all of us to think about is walking the talk isn't just doing the inside work. It's also making sure that the outside work, and Google has done an amazing job of this too, but the work that you put outside of your organization equally reflects those same DE&I values. That's what's going to make people want to come work for you too. One way to have a great, recruit diverse talent is to have diverse offerings within the set of products and the work product that you put forward.
Yeah, for this question, I'd like to echo something Mike said earlier. When you look at C-level positions and in the CEO position in particular, right? Only 1% of Fortune 500 CEOs are Black. Even in our sample, which goes beyond the Fortune 500 and includes as many publicly traded companies as we could find, it's still only about 2%, right? So looking at statistics like this and looking from the outside, it's no wonder that people are going to wonder, like, are companies really serious at the end of the day? If that's what the leadership of corporate America looks like. So these statistics, just, when it comes to CEOs, top executives, is something that I'm really keenly watching and would really signal that there's big change happening. So this is a little different from boards of directors, right? Boards of directors, there is more representation, but people could look at that and, it's a bit less, real change to some people, right? So CEO positions, C-level executives, that's something I'm really looking at.
Yeah. Well, Stacy did a wonderful shout out for Google, but I also want to do a shout out for Nielsen. You all aren't so bad either when it comes to this work. So I appreciate the efforts from both organizations, for the record. And I have 500 people that witnessed me saying it. So I have another question. In building a business case for diversity, equity, and inclusion talent, how do we move beyond tokenism and beyond buzzwords and into creating sustainable cultural realities for DE&I in corporate America? Thank you, Derek, for posting it as well.
I think we have to really understand equity and, Derek, really have more equitable strategies. I mean, so often when we heard that, talked about this work, we focused on equality, like it's only, very recent that we have DEI, and the E actually stands for equity. But equity means that we go above and beyond to bring people up who are like below parity, like to close the gaps to parity. We have to do more for those groups to get to the line of parity. And I don't think that that's fully realized. So I think what we're talking about, transparency, measuring each part of that process, and not just looking at like who's not here, but the people that are here, like, have we really fulfilled the promise of the social construct of what it means to join and how those careers are progressed? So I think that there's more to uncover and more to do that really focus on like the true meaning of what it means to have equity sustainably within a company.
Anyone else? All right. Here's another one. The Latino community at times feels detached from this narrative, and whether it's because they are not included or because they exclude themselves. How do we create a more collaborative effort between our communities?
Well, I guess I'll start with that one since I'm Latina, and I've heard this quite a bit. But I think one thing that we need to remember is that any identity group's success is all of our success. And I think, there has been a lot of, and rightfully, I suppose, so, work for people, not to separate, but to develop their own identities, even within the Latino community, different, we have Afro-Latinos, we have just all the different identity groups within, and everyone wants to be recognized as, and I relate to that for our own identity. But as we all came together in 2020 with our Black brothers and sisters, and just in general around sort of America's awakening around this, horrific racism and colorism and just everything that had been pushed down for so long, we can do the same in the success that we see in DE&I in corporate America. The Latino community, I have heard this quite a bit. And I think the community is trying, is doing their best efforts from what I have heard to come together. But I also think we're doing a bit of a disservice to ourselves as we don't, wrap arms with our other brothers and sisters, the Native American community who, doesn't have the numbers of the Latino community, but certainly could use our support as well. We have a large segment of the Latinx community that is indigenous as well. And I think there are so many synergies that we can look for rather than standing back and not being part of the growth of any one of the diverse identity groups.
Yeah.
I would say in the last 6 to 8 months, there's been a more concerted effort, at least in outreach toward people like me, for reporters who are covering this, to sort of present the situation. The Latino Corporate Directors Association, LULAC, there's been a couple different efforts to kind of bring the business case forward in terms of talking about the size of the market. There has been this recognition that a lot of change happened over the last 2.5 years, and to some degree Latinos were left behind. But it's not militant, it's collaborative. Like what Stacey was describing does appear to be happening as people are trying to figure out how can we link all this together. And we've even started to look at it like that a little bit more. We've looked at the sort of share of underrepresented people on boards. When you do that, I know, boards aren't the best indication, but they do set the sort of the policy for what the company is going to follow. And when you kind of look at underrepresented people on boards, it's really impressive how much things have changed. So there are things happening, and there is this sense of collaboration that that we're seeing that's different than what it may have been 3 or 4 years ago.
Yeah, I would agree. It is growing, but to the point that was mentioned, there's obviously areas of opportunity for acceleration. But I know even in our organization with the Executive Leadership Council, we have an alliance partnership with the Hispanic Association of Corporate Responsibility, HACIR, where the driver is the recognition that at the leadership level, Jeff, to your point earlier, it's sort of a universal challenge between those communities, and also with the Asian Pacific Islander community as well. And so, focusing on how we can be more intentional about not only raising the awareness of this with corporate partners, but the development opportunities for people to be supported to increase the probability for consideration for those kind of roles is much more of an intentional thing that's being dealt with and worked on currently than it's been in the past, driven by that same universal sort of factor. But I think that question was a really good one, to remind us that, it's not just one particular group that has a lion's share of being underrepresented at a significant level. And all of us will serve each other better, to your point, Stacey, by focusing on every person that advances, the whole community advances if we're working on this together. So I really do appreciate that question. I'm told I have time for at least a couple more. How do we refute the notion of a zero-sum game, particularly when you're leading diversity, equity, inclusion internally and diversifying your talent pipeline?
I think we have to turn to the data. We keep talking about that, but I can't underscore it enough. We have to use the data to inform where we are. We have to show where gaps are based on what we have available internally, what's available externally, and then track that progress and continually communicate that data. I will tell you, as part of the role that I have, I'm constantly briefing. I have a wonderful CEO, Sundar Pichai, who's incredibly supportive, as well as his whole leadership team. But I'm with them on a regular basis. I meet with his direct reports on a regular basis. I meet with the Alphabet board on a quarterly basis. And so I'm always talking about what we're doing. And some we get really right, and some we still have a lot of opportunity in front of us. But it's always grounded on the data and the gaps, and are we making progress or not? And that regression analysis is really important about why not and what the leverage points are.
Good. Thank you. Thank you.
And I could throw something in there too.
Go ahead, Jeff. Go ahead.
It's just like Melanie said, the data doesn't show any evidence that like white people aren't able to have jobs. I mean, the idea of the white male has lost his opportunity in the workforce is just not in the data. I mean, if anything, it's as good as it's ever been almost. So there's really no evidence that this is a, win-lose kind of situation in any way you look at it. It's really is one of those things where it's all anecdotal. It's all a feeling more than a reality. And having these conversations and taking it from us and them into us is always more helpful. And I think that's starting to happen as well. When I talk to companies that are undergoing change, it's disruptive, but there's also there's just no demographic reality that this has been some kind of sea change where suddenly there's an underrepresented group that is, we're still in the majority as white men. So.
Yeah.
But Jeff, it's a good point that you bring that up, because from the conversations taking place around affirmative action with college, it feels like there was a lot of pressure, or at least the attempt to have this dialogue around some people losing for other people to win. We see it coming from, personal corners of our lives at school board levels, as someone put in the chat talking about CRT and just, all of these places. And I think, again, this is one of those places, Mike, where we talked earlier, it makes sense for us to stay together on this journey.
Yeah, that is one of the hottest topics of our reporting right now, is sort of the anti-ESG backlash, and ESG being environmental, social, and governance, and social is the S in this conversation. It is very effective. It may not be changing what's happening, at like the base level, but it's got companies really afraid. I mean, I guess in that way it could. I mean, companies are definitely reacting to this in a way that has slowed everything down. They're trying to figure out, now, wait, I'm getting it both ways. I'm going to be more careful.
Yeah.
Well, I think it helps. One, Jeff, I wanted to say hallelujah, amen when you were talking. But two, I believe ESG is the sustainable route where we get beyond tokenism. Is it DEI? It's not just DEI. It's really about how we lead, our corporate social responsibility, and our stewardship capability. And the S in ESG really helps cement that. So I love the progress that we're making with ESG. And as I see around the corner, I think that is another path forward for sustainability of the work we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, especially considering the fact with ESG and the S in the ESG is really starting to gain steam as it relates to accountability and metrics that associates how you're going to make the progress in that area sustainable in a way that influences the investment community. It has gotten the attention of a lot of organizations who are thinking about this with that angle in mind, in addition to thinking about it as a fairness issue. So there's a lot. To your point, I really wanted to at least acknowledge how much I appreciate the reminder of and the drumbeat of ensuring optimism is at least part of the conversation, as opposed to just this massive dark cloud in the face of these headwinds that we should just go into the corner in the fetal position and just be frustrated, but to step up and lean in like you all are doing on this area. I want to give each of you the opportunity in closing for any closing remarks or comments that you'd like before we wrap this up, since we're at the 5-minute mark. And given the significance of you and your contribution in this discussion and in your respective fields, we want to give you the floor. And Dr. Jung, we'll start with you since we started with the research, and then go around to the others.
Oh, I just would like to close by saying that I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, and I um, learned a lot through the discussion. And as an Asian person of color, I'm honored, to be an ally to the Black community as well as the Latinx, LGBTQ, and other communities that are marginalized in society and in business. And I look forward to shedding light on DEI issues through my research and engaging in conversations like this in the future. So thank you very much.
It's good to have you.
I can go next. Okay.
Jeff, I'll just assign. Go for it.
So, I mean, I guess my job is a little different than maybe the rest of the group. I'm here to basically chronicle as opposed to affect change. But I mean, I'm looking for what companies are saying they're going to do, and then I'm going to see what they're doing. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, if you say you're going to do it, then do it. I'm watching. If you're not going to do it, then don't say it. Don't be hypocritical. And if you say you're going to do it, then show me the proof. Don't give me half the information. Give me all the information. Give everybody all the information so we can see what's happening. I think that's really key to what we're doing here. As Melanie said, repeatedly, transparency is really important in this conversation. Again, it's really good for me to hear these conversations and also be willing to hear, what the opposition is saying and look for opportunities to address some of those things, because not enough people are talking to each other right now. We're just kind of talking around each other. So I think that's important for any progress, because we kind of reach a point where there is sort of this concern that it's win-lose. And I think we need to communicate that better.
Yeah, thank you. When you were talking, the word preach, Jeff, preach was coming through my mind when I was bringing it up. Stacy, how about you?
I first want to acknowledge that there's a movement and part of this conversation that adds the A, right? DEIA. We haven't talked at all about accessibility or the disability community. That do belong and deserve a letter in part of this DE&I. And the reason I bring this up is because increasingly, and we talked about this today, this conversation about ESG and DE&I and the intersection of all of our worlds, it's conversations that are happening now outside of this tier, which is ESG or DE&I within organizations, right? These conversations are happening from our sales teams to our recruiting teams to our product teams. And I actually think that's a really good thing. It sounds very operational in nature, right? I'm here talking about this sort of operational, component. But when this conversation moves from the pillars where we work out to coming out of the mouths of folks throughout the organization, we have made progress. I agree it has been slow, and we've been talking about that here. But the more people that are talking about it and the more people that own their part of this, so it's not just happening in supplier diversity and happening over in DE&I, but it's a conversation taking place throughout the organization on different levels, I think the better off we all will be.
Thank you. Melanie.
I just want to remind all of us that we are the change that we've been waiting for, and we all have a stewardship responsibility to continue to advocate for the change that we all aspire to. We collectively own that future. And when we really dig in and we ensure that those that are performing at the least or progressing the least amount of time, we're improving outcomes for everyone. And so we have to continue to reach down and make sure that we're providing equitable strategies that are sustainable, and we never take our eye off the ball. This is very different than what many of us learned in business school, that there's this bell curve that goes up, goes across and down. I don't believe in our lifetimes that we're going to see that. This is up, 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 up. And how do we sustain ourselves to stay, keep our eye on the ball and to continue making progress?
Wow, great. Well, this has been a wonderful discussion, but unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there for now. But Stacy, Jeff, Dr. Zhang, Melanie, I want to thank each of you for taking the time to join me for today's conversation. I appreciate how you've demonstrated allyship and a sense of partnership in such an important area that actually is making a difference in the country and the world at large as a result of your efforts. All of us benefit from having these critical discussions with thought leaders like you, whose perspectives are informed by decades of experience across sectors. And for those of you who joined us from across the country and around the world, thank you. And on behalf of all of us here at the Executive Leadership Council, happy holidays to you and your families. And we hope you'll join us again soon. Take care.
Adios.